Hi, everyone. I'm Kris Spisak, and I get asked questions about writing and editing all the time. So I thought I'd collect my top 10 questions that I hear so you can have some answers moving forward. So number one, let's get started. What is my biggest advice for fiction writers? I hear this question all the time, so it's my favorite place to start. My biggest advice for fiction writers: remember that the book is yours, and the best person to begin the revision and editing process is you. You shouldn't get to the very last page of your manuscript and then say, okay, done, let me hand it off to an editor. Because an editor who's looking at typos, who's looking at punctuation, isn't necessarily going to understand your vision. They aren't going to understand the ideas, the dream that came to you with this entire project. So first, think about what are you trying to achieve? And remember, the editing should begin with you, and it should begin in phases. You don't begin with proofreading, which is the final step. You begin with looking at the big pieces of the picture, making sure your story, narrative structure makes sense, making sure your characters have depth, making sure you're writing with a nice integration of multiple story elements. There are big questions to ask yourself to make sure you are doing justice to the story idea that you once had, because that idea can be amazing if you take the time to pull it out of yourself. Finishing that rough draft is amazing, but make sure you do the editing side too. Go look at the big picture ideas. Look at the small language choices that you're doing, making sure you're not using repetitive language, making sure you're not using cliches. And then only after you've gone through a big picture edit and a middle grade, or not middle grade fiction, but a middle tier edit, that micro edit I sometimes talk about, and then the proofreading, only then is your book really ready for the next stages of its publishing cycle. Whether you are querying that project for a literary agent, for a traditional publisher, whether you are working with an editor to get that final line edit before you are publishing, whatever it is, my biggest advice for fiction writers: make sure you are doing your story justice by taking the time to do some of that editing yourself. Question number 2, when is my book done? And this is where you kind of put your book up on the stand and you interrogate it. Have you gone through that process? Have you asked yourself whether its beginning is in a place that makes sense for the entire story? Have you looked at its ending to make sure that ending ties up everything? Have you looked closely at every single chapter to make sure it fits with the whole? Have you checked to make sure you don't have tangents wandering off somewhere? There are so many questions to ask of your book before it is officially done. One of my favorite ways to look at this is to feel like, is there a moment in your book, or is there something about your book that you feel you might be getting away with it? If there is at any point something about your manuscript where you think you're pulling it off, you think you're getting away with it, then maybe you're not there yet. You need to know. You need to be absolutely confident that every single scene is there for a reason. Every single character is there for a reason. Every single word is there for a reason. It was Leonardo da Vinci who said, maybe he was looking at the Mona Lisa. It was Leonardo da Vinci who said, art is never finished. It is only abandoned. So we all do need to find our point where we feel comfortable abandoning that project and letting it go on to the next steps of its journey. But make sure you're not letting it go when you have something niggling the back of your mind. If you have that voice in the back of your head about something specific, I'm not talking about just a matter of confidence. We all have moments. It's the writer's world to have this confidence that is, I am the greatest in the world. Oh, I'm no good at this. We all have that roller coaster. However, if you have a niggling voice in the back of your mind saying that there is something that you are not sure you are pulling off specifically, listen to that voice. Keep working. When you get rid of all of those moments of your story, then perhaps it is done. Then perhaps is when you turn to your beta readers or editors or whatever you have for the next step of your process. Next question, and I really like speaking to this one because I can speak to both sides of this equation. What does a writer-editor relationship look like? Now, first things first, we have to get a couple definitions out of the way. A writer-editor relationship is working about empowering the writer's manuscript. However, an editor is not a ghostwriter. An editor is not someone who takes a rough manuscript and rewrites it and fixes it and empowers it. That is a ghostwriter or a wordsmith. That is not an editor. An editor's job is not to rewrite. An editor's job is to empower and help the writer bring their manuscript to the next place. So keep that in mind, first things first. So I like to think about the author-editor relationship as a true partnership to take this manuscript to the most powerful place that it can come. All right, so what does this mean? This means that a writer might work with an editor on a couple different phases, and keep in mind, different editors have different specialties. So you might have a different editor that you work with in a developmental phase or a macro editing phase than you might work with on a copy edit or a micro editing phase. You might have a different editor completely in the line editing phase of your project or the proofreading side of your project. Just like people have favorite genres, just like people have favorite places that they work in their expertise in other professions, editors also specialize. They specialize in different types of books. They specialize in different types of edits. So maybe you're going to have one editor that you're going to work with on multiple phases. Maybe you're going to have some beta readers that work with you and then editors take on other pieces. But just know, if you're ever working to hire an editor, you want to make sure that they work in the area that you need. Because as I've said, a book needs to go through multiple phases of revision, from big picture all the way down to your punctuation and grammar and typo proofread, all right? So when you're working with an editor, make sure that they work in what you need. All right. And of course, if you're ever working with an editor, it's a great time to get references for that person. Make sure they're a reliable person, because editors can be expensive and you don't want to hand over money to someone who you don't know they're legit. Because unfortunately, just like everything in the world, there are a lot of people out there who are not legit, who don't have a track record, or maybe just they don't necessarily have a good background, good relationships in their past. So make sure you do a little bit of vetting before you hire an editor on making sure they're having a contract, just making sure this is a business deal between you and that individual. So looking at that author-editor relationship, sometimes it is something where an author and an editor work through one pass of a manuscript and then it gets handed back to the author to take on, to do whatever they want with it. Sometimes that relationship is ongoing, where the author and editor have a relationship that goes through many phases of the manuscript as it gets closer and closer to being ready for publication. And of course, sometimes, these are sometimes my favorites, is when you have that true relationship. It's like a marriage in so many ways, where you get to work together and pour your hearts and souls into something together. And then maybe for the next book, you come together again. And for the next book, you come together again. Author-editor relationships can be very special, but just like marriages, just like dating, you need to find the right fit in multiple capacities. So always be thoughtful on this, but when you find a match that works for you, works for your genre, works for your needs, it can be a wonderful, wonderful experience. And then in the end result, you have a book that absolutely shines. Another question that pops up a lot is, what does show don't tell mean? It's classic writing advice. There are so many pieces of classic writing advice that we hear all the time, but this is an important one. So I like to make sure that folks know the difference. I like to explain it like this. When you think of show don't tell, I want you to think of two different pieces. One, I want you to think of a narrator who is telling the reader that he is a really loyal friend. No, they're telling the reader this. The difference between telling the reader that he is a loyal friend versus showing the reader that he is a loyal friend is the narrator saying it in narration versus a scene unfolding where the reader watches things happen, where the character makes choices and shows himself to be undoubtedly loyal by a scene that plays out, by the actions that happen through that scene. Do you see that difference? There's something you could say in a paragraph by the narrator, he is loyal, versus watching him take action in a surprising way that shows his loyalty. As a reader, which is more profound? Hearing, he is loyal, or watching a scene unfold that demonstrates it? Think about this. As a writer, You can be more effective when you are showing things unfolding. People do so many things, and it is their actions that define them, not necessarily somebody handing you a card and saying, I am a good person. No, that's just telling. Show that person so they are unique, so they are individual, so they are living up to certain adjectives. Then you are showing who your characters are. The same is true with emotions. You could say that she is angry, or you could watch her anger inside of her body and by the actions that are showing how absolutely furious she is. What's more powerful, the narrator saying she is angry or watching that anger unspool on the page? Showing versus telling. It's a matter of your reader feeling and understanding by observation, and that is powerful. We talk a lot about beta readers, but sometimes people don't really know what that means. So let's take a moment to answer this common question. What's the point of beta readers, and how do I use them most effectively? Now, what is a beta reader? A beta reader is simply an early reader of your book, someone who is reading your manuscript before it is actually published, all right? So when you have your beta readers, they might give you some valuable input that might shape your book in turning it into something that is stronger than it might have otherwise been. They might show places where it is weak. But it's really important when you're thinking about your beta readers of who should you use. Yes, many people do use paid editors in lieu of beta editors if they cannot find anyone suitable. But if you have a writing community that you are part of, whether that writing community is online or in person, that's a great place to find people. Now, other writers can be powerful beta readers sometimes because they have an insight into the writing process and what you're perhaps wanting to do. Other really powerful beta readers include those who read the genre that you are writing. If perhaps you are having a romance novel that you're working on and someone reads your romance novel who is not a romance reader, they might not have any tips or advice or thoughts to share that really make sense with your manuscript. You always have to think about beta readers in terms of, is the advice they're giving something that makes sense? Because again, who's the author of the book? You are the author of the book. Everything that someone tells you may not be something that needs to change about your book or be tweaked about your book. You need to think about it though, to make sure they're coming from the right place. Okay, so someone who writes in your genre, someone who reads in your genre, someone who is a writer. Also make sure it's someone who can give you some solid advice. Someone who is a spouse or family member, for example, mothers, might give you a squeeze and a pat on the back and say, I'm so proud of you, that was excellent. But a beta reader who does nothing more than say that was interesting, or that was a good read, or that was excellent, that doesn't help your process at all. So make sure if you're giving it to folks, I mean, who doesn't love a pat on the back, right? But make sure if you're looking for a beta reader who will help you, make sure it's someone who does have perhaps even the slightest qualifications for that. And if you're not sure, if you have a friend who's a voracious reader and you're thinking they might be a good beta reader, maybe give them a couple prompts. Maybe you could tell them just to answer a couple questions. Ask them, what did you find most interesting? Where were you kind of bored, or where were you not very interested? Who is your favorite character? Who is your least favorite character? Was anything unexpected? Did anything not make sense? Were any motivations unclear? Ask them very specific questions to answer. You don't need to give them a worksheet or a formal review process to do, but just giving them a couple questions that will help you figure out, are your characters working? Does your plot make sense? Does the core theme of your story come out like you're wanting it to? Some guiding questions for beta readers can be very powerful. And again, we understand our writing so much, but sometimes it gets stuck in our head and does not translate down our neck, out our shoulders, down our arms, to our fingers, to the keyboard. We know what we're trying to say. So having eyes on your manuscript that are not your own eyes can be incredibly valuable to gain a new, fresh perspective on what you have actually accomplished with your manuscript. So beta readers, editors, these are valuable, valuable pieces of the puzzle that you must find. Again, beta readers can be found in many different ways. And if you can't find them, that's what editors are in the world for as well. But just make sure you have somebody's eyes beyond your own on that manuscript before you go on to next steps. There are so many conversations around the vocabulary of publishing that I like to take a pause with this question, which I do receive a fair amount. Why do you prefer indie publishing rather than self-publishing? And I think where this question comes from in a matter of preferring is a matter of just simple language choice. People toss about these words synonymously in terms of you are the author and you are the one who is making your work happen. You are not working with a publisher. You are not working with some major team to make it happen. However, I'm going to pause on that word team because that's kind of the key to these two different terms. If you ever hear someone talk about indie publishing versus self-publishing, often they mean the exact same thing. You as the author are the one who's making the decision that it is time for this book to come out into the world, and you as the author are making it happen. If that is you and your publishing path, awesome. However, I like the term indie publishing. And when you hear me speak, I almost always use indie publishing rather than self-publishing because indie publishing has an independent spirit, but self-publishing seems like it's something you're doing by yourself. And here is the secret to self-publishing. And it's not a secret. I have a feeling you already know this. The secret or not so secret idea is that you can't do this alone. If you are doing this alone, it is not going to be nearly as successful of a project as if you have partners in the publishing process. I am not saying that you need to have a publishing team out of New York. I am not saying that you need to hire multi-$1,000 publicists. I am just saying that you need a team. This is where the beta readers come in. This is where editors come in. This is where book designers come in, cover designers, formatters. To do a book well does not just mean having a good story in your head. It means getting it onto the page well, articulately, clearly, making sure it's all as powerful as can be, but also to make sure your paragraphs are aligned correctly, your quotation marks are facing the right direction. There are so many subtleties. Making sure you have a cover that doesn't look like something you made at home with a lack of expertise, to make sure it has a cover that will attract readers, a cover that fits perhaps within the genre which you are writing in. There are so many subtleties to this process. And the difference between indie publishing and self-publishing might just be a difference of vocabulary. However, it's also a bit of a mindset. You can do this, but you're not alone. And you can build a team. It doesn't have to be an uber expensive team, but you can build a team to empower yourself to make sure what you are delivering to market is the best possible book you possibly can put out there. All right. That's why I prefer indie publishing, which insinuates kind of a creative team is behind it rather than self-publishing, which makes it seem like it's all you. You are a workhorse if you are indie publishing. However, you don't have to be alone. So that's the spirit of the difference here. Now, this is a question that you could have an entire online course for weeks built around this question. What are the pros and cons of indie publishing versus traditional publishing? Now, I'm only going to speak to a couple little details. However, these are a couple details that I feel like the world should know a little bit more. So if you are trying to make that decision between going with a traditional publisher, whether they're a small publisher, whether they're someone out of New York or some other major publishing mecca, there are choices to be made. And here's where I like to think. What are your goals with your book? What is your timeline goal with your book? How much work are you willing to put in yourself? How much money are you willing to put in yourself? Now, these are the big questions to ask yourself because, as I've noted, if you are indie publishing, to do it well, you need to make sure you have this creative team around you. You need to make sure that you are the writer, you are controlling your vision, you are controlling your project, but you're probably going to have people helping you along that way, that editor who is a partner in crime to make sure you don't have any typos, to make sure that clarity is there, your story is speaking to the essence of what it could be. You need to make sure your book is formatted correctly because it'd be really clunky and it really shows off how homemade something can be if your book formatting, when you're going through it, if the typeface is off, if the page numbers are not aligned the same way on every page, it shows off not your best self if, again, your book cover looks homemade. You need to have that kind of team through it. However, if you build your own team, you can control your own project. You can bring it to market on whatever timeline you want. And that is a little bit of magic sometimes. Now, on the other side of things, with traditional publishing, you will not have to pay anything. You're not paying any editors. You're not paying any formatters, any cover designers. All of that is being done by the publishing house. So you have zero money out of pocket with those pieces of the process. Now, when it comes to the difference between these two things, a traditional deal will happen much slower, not only because the difference between being accepted and a book coming to market can be anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. Yes, 2 years for the traditional market. That is a much bigger lifespan, or not lifespan, that is a much bigger span that you might have to wait to see your book before it is on bookstore shelves. Indie publishing, you can make it happen much faster, but I always do like to remind you, speed does not necessarily always keep in mind the quality of product. So always make sure you can go as fast as you'd like, but just make sure you're doing a quality product on that side. So the difference here being you're not paying for things with traditional publishing when it comes to the editorial, when it comes to the book cover, when it comes to the formatting, all of that is being taken care of by your publisher, where indie publishing, you're doing it yourself or you're going to be using a creative team to do it. Timeline wise, traditional will take a much longer process than indie publishing. And of course, with the traditional side of things, there is a matter of also being accepted, which, as many of you probably know, querying, pitching, all of that process, often literary agents are a part of that process. It takes a long time sometimes to get that person to have that deal, to have that relationship solidified. This can be months, this can be years, depending on your project. So again, traditional publishing has a much larger lifespan. Now, in the past, there has been a legitimacy issue between traditional publishers who are taken much more seriously than independently published book. I think the stigma is honestly going away. However, there will be some places, perhaps in mainstream media, where it still is a little bit of a roadblock, where some people don't take it quite as seriously. There are specific things that you as an independent publisher will have to negotiate, perhaps with independent bookstores, to even get your books on the shelves, which is less of an issue if you were traditionally published. You wouldn't even have to have your fingers in that if you are traditionally published, those relationships with bookstores in terms of distribution of your book. However, there are pros and cons. What are your goals on timeline? What are your goals on money? What are your goals on audience? If you would like to have an audience where it's just you want to get this book out there, it's a life goal, you want it for your family, there is nothing stopping you from independently publishing that. If you want to be taken seriously by all of the national news media, that will be a whole lot harder if you're independently published. There are so many pieces of this puzzle, and I am probably thinking or not thinking of a number of things that I should be adding here. However, that is the beginning of this conversation. More on that, I'm sure, later. Another big question for us: how do literary agents fit into the publishing process? Now, I have a fun perspective on this because at the time of this recording, I have 4 books out in the world. And of these 4 books that are out in the world, 1 has been traditionally published with a literary agent. 2 have been independently published, and 1 has been traditionally published without a literary agent. So it's kind of fun to see the different pieces of the puzzle and the pros and cons of each place. Because again, one author can have multiple publishing paths, even just depending on the book, depending on the genre, depending on so many different pieces. However, where does that literary agent fit? If you have a goal of going with a major publisher, you will not be able to access or pitch that publisher unless you have a literary agent. A literary agent is often kind of a vetting system for the big publishing houses, that they show kind of who is writing at a quality of a level that should be traditionally published. So they're kind of the gatekeepers to allow access to the big dogs in publishing. So yes, that means they say a no to a whole lot of people because this is their job. However, if you are going this path and you are working and working and working and sticking to empowering your craft and working on empowering your storytelling, you can absolutely get there. And with a literary agent, They can help pitch to bigger publishing houses, and they will help you sometimes in the editing of your novel to make sure it is as empowered as possible before it goes to that publishing house. But is that going to say that if you have a really bad manuscript, they're going to take it and see its potential? No, unfortunately. This is a super competitive publishing world we are in the midst of right now. Your book needs to already be spit polished to a shine for a literary agent even to consider it. Because yes, so many books have potential, but in this competitive publishing landscape, it's the ones that are there. It's the ones that are almost there that are going to have that breakthrough to the next level of getting a literary agent. So sometimes literary agents work as editors. Sometimes they work as strategy partners. They often work almost in a legal capacity as a lawyer, negotiating your contract, your advance, your royalties, all of your rights of your contract with your publishing house. My literary agent, I like to think of her as a friend in this process, because when I have questions about, is this okay? Should I even push back on this? Even when I'm thinking about media, my literary agent is a great support system who knows the ins and outs of the publishing industry so well that I can go to her and ask questions when I need an expert to help me. So that's where the literary agent comes in. Does everybody need a literary agent? No, it depends on how you're planning on publishing. It depends on your publishing goals. However, when you have a literary agent, it does sometimes allow access to different types of traditional publishing, especially the big houses who otherwise do not accept pitches from writers directly, right? Here is another really big question that we could have an entire online class about. What is your favorite way to market a book? Now, I like to think of this as a very simple question. What are your strengths? If you are an amazing public speaker, think about how you can utilize that as a key strategy. If you are someone who is really great with analytics and SEO, think about how you can use that to your strength. Think about how you could use content marketing and blogging and podcasting to help marketing your book. Think about how you can work with building relationships personally and networking at events to market your book. There are 101 plus ways to market a book. But the biggest question I always like to throw back with this is thinking about yourself. What are your best talents when it comes to marketing? If you're thinking about writing press releases and pitches and all of this stuff and just quaking in your boots a little bit, it's absolutely okay. You can always have partners in crime to take care of the pieces that you don't like. You can always learn and try and try lots of different things. However, I'm guessing out of the whole line of things that you can do to market your book, there's probably at least one that you can cling on to and say, this can become your wheelhouse. So as you examine all of your possibilities, look at those and look at yourself and think, what am I good at? What do I enjoy? And take that one thing and go all in with that one thing. Does that mean you're going to become a bestseller? Not necessarily, but it is a starting point. When you are thinking about marketing and what will be most effective, the most effective thing is to go with your strengths. Find that and you will be off. And lastly, here's a sometimes serene, sometimes heartbreaking question that I hear a lot. How do I know if I should keep going? Now, that can be a really hard question, especially in this world of gatekeepers and waiting and rejection. The writer's life is not an easy life. The creative life never has been. However, do you feel joy when you share your stories? Do you feel joy when you're sitting at a keyboard? Ask yourself, why is it that you're doing this thing? Maybe it's because you have something inside of you that's aching to come out. Maybe because you want to write that story you've always wanted to read. Go back to that question. Why is it you want to do this thing? Why is it that you perhaps feel like you're torturing yourself over this creative life that you might be living? Go back to that question and say, why do I do this? Is there a reason I should keep going? And I have a feeling when you go back to that core idea of why you do this in the first place, you might find a little bit of your answer. And maybe your answer is taking a single project that's not working for you and putting it in a drawer, whether it is a digital file or a file in your file cabinet, and putting that away for a little while and starting something else. Maybe it's taking a little bit of a break for a little while to find some fulfillments and to refill your creative well. That is absolutely okay. That is not giving up. That is maintaining a little bit of your own spirit, your own soul, which you need to do sometimes. So don't ever feel like you're giving up if you're taking a pause. Just think of it that way. Sometimes we all need to take a pause, and that's absolutely okay. Okay. And otherwise, think about, why do you do this thing? And if you come up with that answer, I think you'll know whether you should keep going or not.